Takk for delen. Hyggelig at så mange er kommet hit for å høre hovedkonklusjonene for arbeidsgruppe 2. Det er nå nærmere 5 år siden at arbeidet med denne rapporten begynte, og det er 3 år siden forfatterne møttes for første gang på skrivemøte. Og nå skal de endelig få slippe til med sine hovedkonklusjoner. Vi har 6 forfattere, og vi skal ta det i tur og orden. Vi har et tettpakket program frem til klokka 10. Og det er et balansert og grundig kunnskapsgrunnlag som nå skal overleveres beslutningstagere og til oss alle. Men først, risiko og risikohåndtering er et viktig tema i denne rapporten, og vi tar det ned veldig lokalt når jeg forteller dere nå at rømningsveien er ut den døra der, rett frem, ned trappa, gjennom kantinen og ut en godt merket dør, og toalettet er ut døra og til venstre. Så jeg tror vi bare begynner rett på presentasjonene til forfatterne. Den første som starter det hele er Asun St Clair, som er forskningsleder på Cicero Senter for klimaforskning. Asun har vært hovedforfatter på det første kapitlet i rapporten, som tar for seg mer det overordnede i rapporten og kobler de forskjellige temaene sammen. Og Asun vil holde sin presentasjon på engelsk. Så vær så god, Asun.
Takk. Thank you very much. So welcome to the presentation of the contribution of the working group to the FIS assessment report. This is about impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And we know, and you already know, that the key message is that climate change is happening. But this is not news. What is new in this report is that we know a lot better how it's happening, why it's happening, and what to do about it. The report has assessed a very large number of publications that gives a very nuanced picture of the impacts both on nature and on societies. The report has been divided, and in particular, the summary for policymakers is carefully structured in these 3 different areas. First of all, the observed impacts, the vulnerability and adaptation section. Then we move into the future, understanding future risk, and the opportunities for adaptation. And last, what to do about managing this risk and building resilience. So one of the fundamental differences in this report is this situating climate change as part of society, situating the risk and the opportunities as part of many other risks. This is the figure that frames conceptually the report. And some of you have heard Christopher Field multiple times already using this figure. What it tells us is that climate change risks are in the middle of the variability and the climate impacts, but also questions related to socioeconomic development. How are we mitigating, and how are the governance structures being used in this? So the risk of climate change emerge from this combination of the hazards, the vulnerability, and the exposure of the societies. Climate change impacts are widespread. And those are the observed impacts, the ones that tells us that climate is indeed happening. In this figure in the summary for policymaker, you can see that the impacts are all over the world, and that the impacts are both sectorial and geographically distributed. Evidently, those impacts are not equally distributed, but if you focus your attention in Europe, for example, you will see that there is already observed impacts in fisheries in the Mediterranean and in the North Sea, but also that socioeconomic systems related, for example, to conditions of food security are already emerging as key issues. We know that vulnerability and exposure around the world is very different. People who are poor, people who live in poor housing, people who have lack of access to social protection, to health, lack of institutions, are much more vulnerable to what might be the same climate impact or climate variability. This is a message that you will hear, but it's a message that's very important to take home, is that this vulnerability and this exposure is all over the world, in rich countries as well as in poor countries. And more so as we move into the future. The increasing magnitudes of warming increase the likelihood of severe and pervasive impacts. And the report is very sober and very clear that some of these changes, as we move in a possible 4-degree world where we have failed to mitigate, where we are not adapting, might be irreversible. The summary for policymakers offers a section on key risks. Those are important, and I wanted to dwell a little bit on these key risks. First of all, those are identified with high confidence. I said at the beginning that the big change is not that now we know climate is happening, it's that we know it better. There has been a lot of work in terms of detection and attribution that we need to really understand. There is risk of death, injury, and ill health related to storm surges and coastal flooding and sea level rise in coastal zones and small islands. There is risk of severe ill health and disrupted livelihoods for large urban populations due to flooding. We also have systemic risk to fundamentally important services like electricity, water supply, and emergency services. Mortality and morbidity related to heat impacts, even for people who might be in the future not even able to work outdoors. Food insecurity is a fundamental message of this report, particularly and especially for poor people, but also in terms of increases in food prices affecting everybody. Loss of marine and coastal ecosystems, and we will hear a lot more about this, and effects on water ecosystems, biodiversity, and the goods and services that these ecosystems produce for our economies. In the rest of the presentations, we are going to hear more details about these key issues. We are going to hear more details and specifics about the impacts on marine ecosystems and in the seas. The report has a chapter on oceans and a lot of new research. We are going to hear more about the polar areas and the impacts both in nature and in society. We are going to hear about poverty and about human security and the consequences that climate change may have for poor people and increasing conflict. And we are also going to hear a lot more about adaptation. I want to finish my presentation with the second part of the key message in this report. We know better the impacts. We can imagine better the risk in the future, but we also know better how can societies be made more resilient. And the key message in this report is that the next is now. It is what we do today what will change the future, what will enable societies to move to these climate resilient pathways with a combination of adaptation, mitigation, and transformation towards sustainable development. Thank you.